In this quick video, I want to introduce you to EditInlineNew, a property specifier which lets us be able to define object-based classes in Editor, not as an asset like data assets, but directly inside other asset properties, like you can with structs, for example. It is a C++ specific concept, but even if you're primarily a blueprint programmer, being able to use just a few base classes made in C++ and knowing these tricks can be immensely powerful. Now, to show an example of how we can use this, let's look at how we can essentially create our own actor components, but for any class and object, not just actors. This lets us solve the composition over inheritance problem. Let's imagine we have an item system. We might create a base class for all items to share. Then we might want to have a specific functionality for some items. So we create subclasses like usable item, weapon, currency, etc. But what if we want to have an item that is both a weapon and a usable item? We can't do multiple inheritance in Unreal Engine, and we definitely don't want to create a usable weapon item type with a bunch of duplicated code. This is a classic example of where inheritance fails, especially in game development, and it's why major game engines use some form of ECS, like Unreal Engine's actors and actor components. So in a typical Unreal Engine item system, we can have an item actor, and we can add both a usable component and a weapon component, and that way we have a usable weapon. This, however, falls apart in Unreal if we don't want to use actors for our items. In many modern inventory systems in Unreal, we instead use data assets for defining items. And while we could create subclasses for each type of item from this data asset, we'll run into the same inheritance problem. What you might then be tempted to do is to create a new data asset type for usable item definition, weapon item definition, etc. And that can work, but you'll be exploding your assets folder with these definitions, as every item will basically need its own instance of each type of data asset that it has definitions for. What we would much prefer is to be able to open our item data asset and just add some definitions, for example, for a usable item, and input whatever values we want. This is where EditInlineNew comes in. We can mark any UObject derived class with EditInlineNew, and then importantly, mark any property where we want to reference an instance of that class with instanced. And now we can create instances of these objects in the editor without the need to create assets. And we can do the composition instead of inheritance for items finally. I'm doing it for data assets here, but this will work with any blueprint of any type. It's also worth mentioning that we don't have to create these instances right there in the details panel. We can just create a blueprint based on our item definition base class and reference that instead. This list will show both already created instances and classes we can create instances for. This way we can add some additional logic or share the default configuration between different items. There are two other specifiers we might want in our class. The first is abstract, to prevent us from creating instances of the empty base class. And for good measure, we may also want to mark our class as default to instance together with inline-new. Supposedly this protects us from ending up with, for example, two items pointing to a shared instance of an item definition, which would mean that editing one would also edit the other. In practice, however, despite trying to introduce this problem, I've not been able to produce this unwanted behavior, even when not using default to instance. This is likely because we are forced to add the instance specifier to a property, but it certainly won't hurt to add default to instance here. Now, I've shown you how to use EditInlineNew to enhance my own item system here, but it's certainly not an idea that I came up with. In fact, Epic themselves use it in the Lyra sample project, where they call these definitions fragments in their item system. And I can recommend having a look at the Lyra codebase, especially look for the Lyra inventory item fragment class, which is the equivalent of what I've been working with here. I should of course also mention that there are countless other use cases for EditInlineNew other than item systems. Perhaps you want to add extra definitions for your building types or specific behaviors to an advanced AI system. I'll be doing more videos on how we manage data in Unreal, and I'll also be covering my advanced inventory plugin that I showed you here. It's made for my game War Tribes that I cover over my main channel. So please consider subscribing to this channel and my main channel. Thank you for watching.